cross that line. My love's like a black hole sun, so bright when it burns, so dark when it's done. So hard to relate to one when I find myself tripping off that blunt, tripping off this blunt. So I might be blunt if I do confront you. Don't run, no, don't run from the black hole sun.
I'm gonna be very, very desperate because I love scary stuff. And just mysteries in general.
Oh, so you perfect. Never, no show. You know it. Never, oh no, no nonsense. I was like to walk around like you know shit. I was on me. Oh, so you perfect. Never, no show. You know it. Never, oh no, no nonsense. I was like to walk around like you know shit. I was on me. Yeah, 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 I was on me. Just wanna see sparks when I'm living in the moment. I just wanna see a sign when I made the right choice. I was living in my head, side living in the moment. When I'm stuck in my feelings and I'm stuck in my pride. You've been trying to say hey, but my life's half full. But you got me real good and I feel it in the moment. When it gets low, never stay low. You don't gotta know everything to stay sane. You don't gotta lie to yourself, you wanna be. You don't gotta fly high just to understand. You don't gotta oh, so perfect. Never, no show. No it. Never, oh no, no nonsense. I was like to walk around like you know shit. I was on me. Oh, so you perfect. Never, no show. You know it. Never, oh no, no nonsense. I was like to walk around like you know shit. I was on me. 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 Never gonna stay in the moment. Never see through when the world gon' pass through. When you keep the world in your pocket. Sometimes I spend too much on memory lane. I was catching feelings for bitches twice my age. I was trying to fill some holes that ain't a metaphor. When it gets low, never stay low. You don't gotta know everything to stay sane. You don't gotta lie to yourself, you wanna be. You don't gotta fly high just to understand. You don't gotta never, no show, you know it. Never, oh no, no nonsense. I was like to walk around like you know shit. I was on me. Oh, so you perfect. Never, no show, you know it. Never, oh no, no nonsense. I was like to walk around like you know shit. I was on me.
Fuck a fraction, numbers do not lie. You a dog yet for the captain. Want you by my side as the only main attraction. The way you murking bitches, swear you some type of assassin. Damn, am I gassing? Need you right now for past tense. Yeah, girl, imagine matching my fly high fashion. My line, ball with me. Prime time, get in a mix. Are you fucking with me? I come and roll with me for the night. Let's get right. I got Joe and Hennessy if you're trying to on me, yeah. Baby, this party's on fire. How you feeling right? Time to take this shit higher. Your body smoking, I think we should light up. Now that you're here, I'm glad I could ignite ya. Let's make a scene. 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 Got you fully in focus, but we just pulled up a few more cups. Stress is vanishing like hocus. Pussy some magic, feeling right now. Clear no static with you right now. You know what it is, won't need no trial. I'm thinking you from the inside. We gon' get back and get turned up. Ride me, baby, wavy surf club. Rowdy in the Bobby's murder. Made the kitty dance, leave it murder. Keep dripping on me, so immerse up. Got some ego, got you moving cursively. In the better like a furnace. Hot mommy, put it on me urgently. Call your friends up. I don't value the pants up. Slide to the pin and get bent up. Now this young, I got stamina. Rich sex, so glamorous. You the one, it's unanimous. How you hitting all these high notes? Think the neighbors gon' want a manager. Baby, your body on fire. You so enticing, I'm hypnotized by ya. Your body smoking, mommy, let's get higher. Follow my lead, lock the door right behind ya. Girl of my dreams, 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 let's make a scene. Girl of my dreams, 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 girl of my dreams.
Got it there. Let's get started.
Look at the stars in the raven. Ain't no coming down. Say she low in the rain. But baby, I'm in town. Yeah, my niggas.
What is up, guys? We are actually gonna get started here. This is Mrballen. What he filmed in the secret room destroyed an entire city. Now, this is definitely for, I think this is for mature audiences only, but I mean, yeah. And then after that, we got another one from him. But without further ado, let's stop wasting time. Let's get straight into it.
Today's story comes out of China, and it is a brutal story. There's just no way to tell it without being sort of graphic. So with that in mind, this is definitely a mature audiences only type of story. That said, it is a fascinating story, and the ending is something that very few of you are going to see coming. It's going to feel kind of predictable throughout most of the story, and then it's like the end completely changes your impression of the story. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to power wash the like button's house, but be sure you set the machine all the way up so you blow off their shingles and blast all their paint off, and then you just leave. Just leave it as is. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. One Saturday afternoon in November of 1990, a 26-year-old kindergarten teacher named Su Lixia sat crying on a bench at a train station in the city of Naha, which is located in northeastern China. Su had just left her husband for good. They'd had a bad marriage for a long time. It was very contentious. They fought all the time. And that morning, they had gotten into this major fight. And for Su, it was kind of like the final straw. And so she just stormed into the bedroom, grabbed some things, threw it in a bag, and just stormed out. She was done. But Su really didn't have a plan for what she was going to do once she left the house. And so she found herself just sitting at this train station doing nothing, just staring at the trains rolling in and out over and over again. And as she sat there, again, not knowing what she's going to do, she suddenly took stock of the fact that very few people were getting on and off of these trains, and in fact, the train station itself was weirdly vacant. So the city of Naha, where Sue was actually fairly small by China's standards, even though there was 70,000 people that lived there. The city sat at the base of this towering mountain, and then all around the city in the outskirts was basically just farmland with lots of soy and corn crops. And then as you move closer to the city center, there were lots of things you would expect to see in a city, like tall buildings and, residential and commercial areas. But overall, Naha was just kind of boring. It's like the city was a city, even if it was small, but there was just not much going on. And in fact, if you lived in China, but not in Naha, there was a very good chance you didn't know Naha even existed, like it was kind of irrelevant. However, in the last few months leading up to this moment that Sue is sitting at this train station, the city of Naha had suddenly been put on the map, and everybody knew about this city, because women from Naha were going missing in droves. In fact, Sue herself knew of at least a dozen women who had gone missing over the past few months from Naha. And as these women started going missing, it was making the news all over the country, and women who lived in Naha were acutely aware of the risks of being out alone, in fear that somebody was going to come snatch them up and take them away. In fact, every time Sue would go to work, she would make sure she would walk with other women, like in pairs, to ensure safety. I mean, this was a really scary time if you were a woman living in Naha. However, the caveat to the missing women was all of them to this point, when Sue was sitting at the train station, had been sex workers. And Sue, she thought, in virtue of not being a sex worker and instead being a kindergarten teacher, that somehow she was not actually that vulnerable to being snatched up or, whatever was happening to these women, she just felt like it wouldn't happen to her. But now, as Sue sat at this train station, which again was eerily quiet and vacant, she couldn't help but feel like she had made a bad decision being here.
You gotta be careful out there, man. People are susceptible to people on the streets, no matter what. You gotta be careful.
Eerily quiet and vacant, she couldn't help but feel like she had made a bad decision being here. She felt like she could easily become the next woman who went missing from Naha. And so Sue began to think, maybe I should just go back home and try to patch things up with my husband, mostly for her safety, just to go back inside her home and be safe again. But before she could stand up to do that, she noticed on the other end of the platform this man who was exceptionally well dressed with this beautiful brown wool coat and fancy pants. He looked like he stepped straight out of a fashion magazine. He came up onto the train platform, and without saying a word, he walked slowly down the platform all the way to where Sue was, and he reached into his pocket and he held out a tissue to her because he saw she was crying. And Sue, she's looking up at the sky, and again, there's nobody else here, and she's very much on edge. And she doesn't know what to do. I mean, it was already creepy that this place was vacant, but it's even stranger to have a random man come up to her and try to initiate some sort of interaction with her. It just felt wrong and weird and very suspicious. But as Sue stared at this guy, trying to figure out what his angle was, she could see that he had kind of kept himself standing back from her, kind of a respectful distance, not trying to crowd her out. And he was looking at her with a very sympathetic look on his face, and he's holding this tissue out, and he said to her, "Are you okay?" And he hands the tissue again, like, "Please take it." And there was just something about this guy that felt very sincere, and Sue kind of let her guard down, and she accepted the tissue and wiped the tears from her eyes. She didn't say anything, and then this guy, he said, "Hey, do you mind if I sit with you?" And at this point, Sue said, "Yeah, okay, you can sit down." And so this very handsome, well-dressed man took a seat next to Sue, not right next to her, again, respectful distance from her. And again, he asked her, "Hey, are you doing okay?" And for Sue, whose life had been basically miserable the last few months or even years with this terrible marriage she was in, she wasn't used to being asked if she was okay. And this man, who she didn't know, had caught her at this very vulnerable moment in her life. And it was like all her emotions just came pouring out. And she began sobbing hysterically, telling this guy that no, she was not okay. Her life was in ruins. She had just abandoned.
Sorry for interrupting the story, but to her it might have been like there's the light at the end of the tunnel kind of thing. Or maybe that's how she felt, but
telling this guy that no, she was not okay. Her life was in ruins. She had just abandoned her family and she had no idea what she was going to do. And finally, when Sue stopped telling this guy all about her problems, she felt very embarrassed and kind of looked up at him like she was sorry for even saying as much. But the man, who was very intently listening, he was just nodding along, very sympathetic, and he told Sue that his name was Gia Wang, and that he was a director at a factory not far from here, and if she was open to it, he'd be happy to think about hiring her at the factory, you know, give her a new start potentially, because it seemed like that's what she really needed. And then he asked her if she wanted to come back to his house to discuss this job opportunity further. Now with this, even though Sue had really appreciated everything this guy had done to this point, the second he asked her to come back to his house, she's like, red flags are going up. She knew there's something off here. Clearly this guy does have an angle, and it's not to benefit me. And so she looked at him with an absolutely suspicious look, like, no way am I going to your house. I don't know you. Like, I appreciate the tissue and you letting me cry, but there's no way. But again, as she's staring at him with the suspicious look, the look on Gia's face remained very sympathetic and very gentle, and it almost seemed like he was just going to get up and go, like, hey, I'm sorry for offending you. But before he did get up to leave, Sue said, hold on. Actually, yes, I'll come with you. She didn't know why she agreed to go with him. Maybe it was because her life was so messed up at this point that she was just kind of ready to take chances and be sort of reckless, and this was definitely that. Big chance, very reckless. But again, she just felt like, you know, there's something sincere about this guy, and she felt like she could trust him. And so Sue and Gia stood up, and together they walked down the train platform, not saying much. They went downstairs, they went out to the street, and they walked a couple of blocks to where Gia's street was. And as soon as they turned the corner and he showed Sue which house was his, Sue looked up, and whatever hesitations she had had still to that point about following the stranger to his house were gone, because she saw his house was beautiful. It wasn't that it was so grand or anything, it totally fit with the neighborhood, but it was very well maintained and totally felt on brand for a guy who was so well dressed and so well manicured and frankly so handsome. So Gia led the way to the front door of his house. He unlocked the door, he opened it up, and then he gently gestured for Sue to come on inside. And so she did. She walked past him. Gia followed her in. And then...
Okay, so you got people going missing in this town, and you're well aware of it, and then you end up going and being, I wouldn't say manipulated, but like you fell for it. I don't know if you like where the story's gonna go, but like you're falling for, hey, come back to my place. Like,
two of them took off their shoes and made their way into the kitchen, where Gia brewed some tea for them, and then they both sat down and began to sip their tea and talk about this job opportunity. And so for a few minutes, you know, Gia is telling Sue all about the role and what she might be doing, and Sue is kind of asking general questions about it, but, you know, for the most part, she just kind of enjoyed being in the presence of somebody who seemed to care about her. But after she finished her entire glass of tea, suddenly Gia, who had been talking this whole time about the factory, just stopped. It was like he was waiting for her to drink that entire drink. And as soon as she was done with her cup, Gia, again, he went quiet and just stared at Sue with this kind of sinister look on his face, like he was very pleased with what was going on. And at that point, Sue looked down at her teacup and then back at Gia, and suddenly she began to feel very drowsy. It was like her vision was beginning to go, and she realized Gia clearly had poisoned her. There was something inside of her tea. And so before she could do anything, everything went black.
What
this is why I
tell y'all. Seriously, what did I just say? I literally was like, you fell for the oldest trick in the book. You fell for the oldest trick in the book. And like, your gut told you no, but for some reason you changed your mind. Bruh. My bad for freaking out.
Weeks later, just a few blocks away from where Sue met Gia at the train station, a police officer named Zhang was standing behind his desk at the police station when a very concerned-looking elderly couple came inside. Now, this couple was here to speak with Zhang about a missing person, but the missing person was not Sue. She had been missing for 2 weeks now, nobody had seen her, but no one had reported her missing. Her husband had just assumed that Sue had left him, and that's why he hadn't seen her, and so he had naturally not reported that. And again, nobody else knew she was missing, so keep that in mind. Officer Zhang has no idea about Sue and Gia, none of it. But when this elderly couple came in to make a missing person report, Officer Zhang was not the least bit surprised. It was now December of 1990, and over the past 6 months, 20 women out of Naha had suddenly gone missing. Remember, Sue is not one of those 20. The 20 are mostly sex workers who went missing at that same train station where Sue met Gia. And so Officer Zhang was used to making all these missing person reports. But candidly, the police actually felt like, because these were sex workers that were going missing, they weren't sure if they were actually being abducted or if they were simply getting on a train and kind of leaving town to go work somewhere else. And so really there wasn't a whole lot of investigation happening to figure out why so many of these women were going missing. But again, Officer Zhang, he's not surprised that they're telling him they want to file a missing person report. But when Zhang took this elderly couple to an interview room to talk to them about whoever was missing in their lives, when this couple spoke, Officer Zhang knew this was different, because the couple was not reporting another missing woman from Naha who also happened to be a sex worker. Instead, they were reporting that a man was missing, a businessman. However, the details of his disappearance sounded eerily similar to all these sex working women who had also gone missing. This guy was last seen at that same train station where Sue had met Gia, and then nobody had seen him, and so that's why they were here. And so Officer Zhang, he wrote up their report, and then he told the couple that, very likely this man is okay, and he'll show up at some point under his own steam, but he told them the police would look into it, and they'd be in touch. However, as this couple got up and turned around and left, Officer Zhang couldn't help but feel like this missing man and all these missing women went missing from the same place, and it's the same city and it's the same pattern over and over again, but now we have a man. And even though Zhang wanted to write it off as an anomaly, he started to wonder if this missing man was connected to all these missing women. Because by January of 1990, months after Sue had gone missing without a trace and still had not been reported by anybody, and 6 weeks after that elderly couple reported that man missing, another 5 people from Naha had gone missing, 2 more women and 3 more men. And so now the police in Naha were looking at 26 people, men and women, that had all gone missing very recently out of Naha, and nobody had a clue what happened to them. And importantly, because now there were men who were not sex workers who were going missing, the police couldn't just write this whole thing off as, oh, these sex working women are just going to another city to go do their work there. Like that was not a possibility anymore. Clearly something bad was happening, and the police knew they really needed to do a real investigation here. So finally, in early spring of that year, the police in Naha formed a task unit and legitimately began investigating all these disappearances. But amazingly, there was like no information. Like there was nothing. These people went missing and nobody heard from them. There was no evidence of where they went. There was not even any sign that anything bad happened to them because no bodies had been found. There was no evidence of really anything happening. All the police knew is these 26 people, not including Sue, so she would be the 27th person, had been at this train station and then vanished. And that's all they knew. And it got to the point where this story really began to spread around China, and it became like this running joke that if you don't want to live, go to Naha, because everybody assumed there had to be some sort of serial killer or something.
What kind of messed up joke is that, dude? If you don't want to live, go to Naha. That's insane. What kind of messed up joke is that? Like, my gosh, bro.
Something happening there who was just roaming the streets, picking people off.
Eve to me is basically freedom. It's a giant open universe where you can do whatever you want. You can have really relaxed, slow pace.
Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. I have a highly addictive personality, and in my life, it's been both a blessing and definitely a curse. When I'm focused on a goal, I become totally addicted to it, and as a result of that, I usually accomplish that goal. But when I don't have a goal to pursue, I often turn to alcohol kind of out of boredom, and then that becomes a very unhealthy addiction. It usually starts with a drink or two with my wife over dinner, totally harmless. But very quickly, I spiral and begin hiding alcohol around the house and drinking by myself in the garage secretly at like midnight after my family's asleep. And invariably, my wife always finds out eventually, and we have the same talk every single time where I promise her I'm never going to do it again, but the cycle always continues. However, this month, with the help of my therapist, I finally decided enough was enough. For my family, for myself, I have to be sober. And so far, sobriety has actually been kind of great. Granted, I'm 3 weeks into the process, but I'll tell you, this time it feels permanent. And I really attribute that to working with my therapist. They're really a big part of the reason that I saw just how destructive alcohol is in my life. So if deep down you feel like you do have some big change you have to make at some point, really consider giving therapy a try, because I'm telling you, their perspective, which you don't have, is the thing you're likely missing. They're able to show you what's going to happen if you don't make that change. Obviously, therapy is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but I'm telling you, it's a great starting point if you're in a similar position to mine. And a very accessible therapy option is a totally online therapy platform called BetterHelp. All you have to do is fill out a quick survey online, and then you'll be quickly matched up with a licensed therapist who will listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you right from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/Mrballen or select Mrballen during sign up to enjoy a special discount on your first month. By late summer of 1991, when really this story had taken hold across the country and was becoming a bigger and bigger deal because there was absolutely no resolution here, police had no idea what was going on, well, the whole situation got a whole lot worse, because now, in addition to people suddenly vanishing at the train station in Naha, more people were also going missing in other cities nearby Naha, but all along the same train line that left out of Naha. So more train stations, more disappearances, all around the area, not just the city of Naha, but all around. And by the fall,
so you got a whole city that has had disappearances happening for quite a while now, all right? And you weren't able to investigate it to a point where it was able to be solved or just even be corrected. And now it's escalated to the point where you're already getting more disappearances in other cities and states nearby. This can't just be more than just sex workers too, because
all of that year, when over 30 people had gone missing all the same way from these train stations all around Naha, the police still had absolutely nothing to go on. All they had is, here are these people, here's where they were, they vanished, we got nothing else. No bodies, no evidence, nothing.
They don't even have any evidence, dude. How do you not have any evidence? Like, seriously, like, that's a serious question. How do you not have any evidence? What is going on? There's no bodies, no fingerprints, no marks, no, like, signs of distress. That is literally insane. And I find that crazy. I don't know what else to say.
But all that would change on October 22nd, 1991, roughly a year after Sue met Gia at the train station in Naha and then drank that drugged tea. On that October day in 1991, so again a year after the disappearance of Sue, police at this train station, 1,700 miles away from the city of Naha, were doing random stops of commuters on the train platform. This had nothing to do with the ongoing investigation into all these missing people. This was just like public safety stuff, where the police were kind of just walking around, looking for people who looked suspicious, and then checking in on them to make sure they weren't doing anything illegal. And on this particular day, at this train station far away from Naha, one of these officers spotted this very handsome guy in a beautiful brown wool coat and very fancy pants and shoes, and he stood out a lot because of, frankly, how beautiful he was. And so the police officer saw him, and this very handsome guy looked up, and he saw the police officer, and it was like immediately he did something very suspicious. He reached down, grabbed a bag, and quickly turned around and began walking away. And at the same time, two other people who were right near this very handsome guy did the same thing. They grabbed bags off the ground, quickly turned around, fell in line with this handsome guy, and began quickly walking away from the police. And so the police obviously are totally suspicious. They run across the platform, and they manage to stop all three of them, and they turn them around, and they say, "Show me your bags, open them up." And the police, they would open up these bags, and they contain drugs. And so right away, these three know they are caught, but they don't say anything. They just stand there, and they're totally silent as the police are asking them, like, "What are these drugs? Where are you going with these? What's going on here?" They're not talking. And so finally, the police go, "Give me your IDs right now." And so all three of them cough up their IDs, and the very handsome guy with the beautiful brown wool coat and fancy clothes, well, that was Jia Wang. The same Jia Wang who had gone with Sue into his house and given her the drugged tea. But again, these police officers are only concerned about the drugs. They don't know anything about these guys. They don't know that Jia met Sue and did this thing at his house with the tea. That wasn't even reported to police. Nobody knew about it. But these police knew they had caught these three people with these bags of illegal drugs, so they brought them back to the station and began to question each of them. And when they spoke to Jia, Jia said nothing. However, when they spoke to the two other people that were with Jia, one of them began to crack. It was obvious they had more to tell about these drugs, and they were kind of holding back tears, like they were very upset. And one of the interrogators, sensing one of these people was prepared to confess to something, instead of really drilling down on them, he was very comforting. And he offered them a blanket and said, "Here, take this blanket, relax, it's okay. You can tell me what's on your mind, it's okay." And that just totally broke this person. And they said, "These drugs are nothing. You need to see what's in Jia's house. That will put these drugs to the side. They won't matter. What's in his house is horrible."
Mrballen got me acting like a freaking owl right now. Ballen got me acting like an owl right now. What the? That makes sense though. Like what actually is actually in this guy's house, considering what he did to that one girl that he gave the tea to. I'm curious to hear what he's done just in general in his own house. And it's scary to think too, because there's like a whole like thought process behind this.
In the police station in Naha, and Officer Zhang picked it up, and it was one of the officers who interviewed these three people with drugs and got this whole horrible confession about what was inside of this guy Jia's house, and he told Zhang all about it. And as Zhang is listening to this, his eyes went wide because he knew this had to be connected to all these people going missing. Like, this has to be it. And so as soon as he hung up the phone, Officer Zhang rounded up 20 other police officers and 10 forensic doctors to go search Jia's house. And when they got there, the house from the outside looked just as beautiful as when Sue had seen it for the first time, and felt like her reservations about Jia had gone down because of how wonderful his house looked. But as soon as all those police officers and the forensic doctors stepped inside of Jia's house, he wasn't home.
Hold up. Well, of course he wasn't home. He's in custody. Or at least I think he is, but... No, but like, if you really think about it, someone that kills someone, there's like a psychological thought process behind it, and I've kind of read into it a little bit, but it's very, very interesting. They feel guilty on the things that they hide, and guilty on the things that they've done in the past, or just in between their own walls that they present as. So they make themselves look and appear as very nice, organized, and very beautiful people, and innocent at the same time, which is very like cryptic. Like, it's a very dark force it's very interesting to get into. But
there was nobody there. When they went inside, they were instantly hit with this horrible, horrible smell inside the house. Even though things are neat and beautiful inside too, there was something bad inside this house. And the smell seemed to be coming from the basement. And so at some point, Officer Zhang and the other officers, they got to the door, they opened it up, and they looked down, and all they could see was just this dark room down there, and the smell was so strong. But they pulled their shirts up over their faces, and they went down the stairs, and when they got down there, they couldn't see anything. It's totally dark. But the smell at this point was so overpowering that a couple of the officers almost fainted. And so literally they had to leave the house fearing they were breathing in toxic chemicals or something, and they had to wear gas masks just to go back into the house and back down into the basement. And when they got back down there, now wearing their masks, it didn't seem like there was anything down there that could produce such an awful smell. Like there was just nothing down there. But eventually one of the officers moved to the middle of the basement, right in the middle, and they realized there was an opening. And they looked down into it and they couldn't believe what they saw. And at the same time, somebody upstairs made an equally horrifying discovery because they discovered a videotape, a VHS cassette that contained this horrible footage that effectively explained what was going on inside of that pit in the basement. But to understand that, we need to go back a year to when Sue met Gia at the train station. She went back to his house and drank the drugged tea and blacked out. After Sue drank that tea, she didn't die. Gia did not kill her. Instead, she woke up a few hours later being totally confused, and she was immediately hit by this horrible smell, but it was totally pitch black. She can't see anything, and she began feeling her hands around her, and she felt stone everywhere she touched, and eventually she realized she was in what felt like the bottom of a well. But it wasn't water she was standing in. She was standing in something that almost felt like jelly, and she began kind of touching it to figure out what it was. She could not tell, but she couldn't help but feel like the things around her were kind of moving, like they were alive. And then suddenly a lid that clearly sat atop of this pit began to slide over above her. And so suddenly light was coming down into this pit. And at first, Sue looked up and she didn't see anything, but then she looked down and realized what was all around her. It was people, dead people, and potentially even half alive people that were just stuffed.
Oh, heck nah. Heck nah. Ooh, ooh. I want to. I'm about to box you, fool. Oh my. And it's hard, y'all, because, like, I have a very, very empathetic and very creative mind, so I'm able to imagine exactly how it is, and it's very, very vivid. Ooh. No. Ooh.
It was people, dead people, and potentially even half alive people that were just stuffed into this big pit that were all kind of decaying or, slowly dying or whatever it was. And she's just standing amongst it all. And then she looks up and she sees it's Gia, the beautiful man who had brought her here. He's standing up there looking down at her with a smile on his face. And Sue...
You nasty. You bad. You wrong for that.
Immediately pleads with him to please spare me, don't kill me. And Gia, he looks down at her kind of inquisitively, and he says, if I lift you out of there, will you do anything I tell you to do? And Sue said, yes, I'll do anything. Just get me out of here, please. And so Gia, he reached down, he grabbed Sue, and he pulled her up and out of this pit inside of his basement.
Are you a hot sleeper? Do you find yourself waking up in the middle of the night over?
A few days later, Sue was back at the train station where she had met Gia for the first time, but this time she was alone, and she walked up onto that train platform with no intention of riding a train. Instead, as soon as she got up there, she began looking around, and then she spotted a businessman who was sitting on a bench. And she walked over to him, and she sat down next to him, and we don't know exactly what she said, but we think what she said was something maybe sexually suggestive or, something along those lines, and she's holding his shoulders and touching his hand. She doesn't know this man, and this man is very caught off guard by this, but he's kind of going along with it. And before long, she takes this businessman's hand, they stand up, and they walk out of the train station down to the street, and they make their way a couple blocks over to Gia's house. And when they get there, Sue leads them to the front door. She opens it up. She brings the man inside. The door shuts. They take their shoes off. And Sue leads this man into the kitchen where Gia is waiting with a wire between each hand, and as soon as this businessman walked into the kitchen, Gia pounced on him, wrapped the wire around his neck, and held it until the man passed out, and then he released the wire. And then Gia and Sue took this man, they lifted him up, and they carried him down into the basement and laid him out on the floor. So he's not in the pit, he's just out in the middle of the basement floor. Then Gia stepped away, picked up a video camera, turned it on, and began to film. He was filming.
Nah. Why are people so freaking? I don't like it. No. Oh, bro, what is wrong with you? Like, what? What got you into that? Ooh, I literally have chills on my arms. Like, literally goosebumps. I never get goosebumps. What the?
The man on the ground, and also Sue. And Sue, she knew what to do. She was going to do anything she was told to do. So she climbed on top of this still very much alive businessman who's just been knocked unconscious, and she straddles him, so she's looking down at his head. Then she picks up a knife and she holds it in front of her, and then she looks up at Gia, who at this point has zoomed the camera in. She can hear the sound, the mechanics inside of the camera as it's zooming in on what she's about to do. And then she raises the knife over her head and drives it into this man's chest. The video that Gia shot of Sue murdering this man was the video police found on the first floor of the house shortly after police had found this horrible pit in Gia's basement. It would turn out that Gia Wang...
That's the pit? That's the pit? That's that thing? Oh my gosh, bro. Ew. Ew, brother. No. What is wrong with you? Like, seriously, what is wrong with you?
Was absolutely the serial killer who was responsible for all these people going missing from the train stations. He would abduct them just like he did Sue, and he would bring them to his house, and then he would do horrible, horrible things to them, and eventually he would chuck their bodies into this pit. And so when he abducted Sue, he actually thought that when he drugged her, that he had killed her, and he had chucked her into the pit, believing she was dead. But when Sue had woken up inside of that pit, when he opened it up and looked down, and there she was, fully alive, he had an idea. Well, why don't I turn Sue into a murderer like me? She can help me. And so that was the condition for her being pulled out of this pit, that she would assist him in murdering people. And she agreed to do it. And so the reason the profile of victims changed from sex-working women to random men is because those are the people that Sue went after. She began targeting men. And so when that elderly couple came in and reported to Officer Zhang that a man was missing, that was Sue's first victim, the man who had been seen on video being stabbed in the chest by Sue. Now, nobody to this day understands why Sue actually went along with this. Like, she was pulled up out of the pit, but then when she was told to go to the train station and find your first victim, it's unclear why she didn't just go to the police and say, hey, there's a serial killer, Gia, here's his house, here's where he is, go get him. For some reason, she just did what he said. And in fact, Sue was not the only person who was brought into this murdering scheme. He managed to convince 3 other people, including his ex-wife, to also commit murders for him.
His ex-wife? Dog, you gotta be hella jealous. For his ex-wife? Nah. Ew, brother. Oh my gosh, dude. That is wrong. And this isn't even the last video. We still got one more after this.
And all 3 of those people also had ample opportunity to flee and tell police, but they didn't. All of these people just did what Gia wanted without asking any questions. It was like he had absolute control over these people. That is, until that day in October of 1991, when those police officers doing a public safety check spotted Gia along with 2 accomplices fleeing with drugs. And they stopped them and they got them back to the station, and one of his accomplices finally broke and told the truth. And the person who told the truth, the accomplice who broke, was Sue. She was there with him at the train station. Nobody knew she was missing, and she was the one who, when offered a blanket and was told, tell us the truth, she came clean. Ultimately, it was this police officer's kindness that broke her. In Gia's basement, inside of that horrible pit, right in the middle of it, were 42 bodies, 24 women and 18 men. In the end, Gia and all 4 of his forced accomplices, including Sue, were sentenced to death, and they were executed on January...
Wait. Wait, hold up. What did you say?
24 women and 18 men. In the end, Gia and all 4 of his forced accomplices, including Sue, were sentenced to death, and they were executed.
Good. As they should be. Because, like... I'm not even gonna...
Executed on January 24th, 1992. Today, the city of Naha is still just as infamous as it was in the 90s when these murders took place. And in fact, the nickname for Naha is now just Bandit City to reflect what happened there.
That's crazy.
I want to create a mildly effective... I want to make a mildly effective cold medicine made exclusively out of Egyptian fire ants. Take its horn off its head and you beat it to death. Say out!
What the? Oh my gosh. Alright. We got one more, y'all. This is people went where they shouldn't have gone, and this is top 3 places you can't go, and then the people that went anyways, and the story behind it. So, I'm excited for this one.
Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button says they need to replace their tires on their Toyota Corolla, offer to do it for them and to pay for them, but make sure you replace their tires with enormous, oversized monster truck tires. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the evening of March 22nd, 1994, a 40-year-old, very experienced airline pilot named Andrei Danilov walked into the cockpit of a huge airplane that he was about to fly out of Moscow. Once he was in the cockpit, he said hello to the 2 other pilots he'd be flying with that night, and then Andrei took a seat in the captain's chair. Now, this flight tonight was going to be a very routine 13-hour trip to Hong Kong, something Andrei and these other 2 pilots had done many times before. But this night, Andrei was totally dreading this trip because one of the pilots he'd be flying with that night was a guy that Andrei just could not stand. His name was Yaroslav Kudrinsky, and he was going to be the relief pilot that night. So Andrei is the captain and the primary pilot. He has a co-pilot or first officer who sits right next to him, and then behind those 2 would be Yaroslav, the relief pilot, who basically is just there in case the captain or first officer needed a break. And so basically, Andrei was going to be forced to interact with Yaroslav all night long. And so as passengers made their way onto the plane, and as Andrei went through his pre-check procedures to get ready for this flight, Yaroslav just started yapping away about how amazing he was and what a great dad he was because he brought his kids on this flight. You know, they hadn't done a big international flight before, and so he was letting them fly with him that night. And then also Yaroslav began talking about this big surprise he had for his kids that was really going to show what an incredible father he really was. Now, Andrei and the first officer were listening to Yaroslav, but they were basically just completely ignoring him. They're not responding to him, they're not feeding into what he's saying, but Yaroslav didn't care. He just kept on rambling on and on and on about how amazing he was. And so finally, Andrei got clearance to take off, and so even though Yaroslav was totally annoying him, he was able to take off, and they went up to their cruising altitude, and they began making their way towards Hong Kong. And the whole time, you know, Yaroslav's just going on and on and on. And finally, 5 hours into this trip, Yaroslav is still just going on and on and on. And Andrei has just had it. He cannot stand to be around this guy anymore. And so finally, Andrei turned around and just cut off Yaroslav, who was mid-sentence about some anecdote about how strong his son was and what a talented wrestler he was. And so Andrei just cuts him off and is like, Yaroslav, take over. I'm taking a break. I'm going to go sleep for a bit. And so Yaroslav would stop what he was doing. He would stand up. He would take his seat in the captain's chair, and he would take over flying the plane. And so Andrei got up. He left the cockpit. He went to the very back of the plane in the main cabin to this row of seats that was reserved for him and the other pilots. And he got in there, and he laid down, and he closed his eyes. But just a couple of minutes after closing his eyes, Andrei began to feel the plane begin to bank hard to one side. Now, Andrei couldn't really remember if this was the time they were supposed to be turning or not, but it just felt like this turn was more aggressive than anything he anticipated at any point in this journey. But Andrei knew this plane was brand new, and so if there were any kind of minor mistakes that Yaroslav was making flying the plane, well, the autopilot feature, which was state-of-the-art in this plane, would easily correct those small errors and keep the plane going towards its destination. And so, even though, again, they're still in this pretty sharp turn here, Andrei just closed his eyes again and tried to go to sleep. But a couple of minutes later, they were still banking, and in fact, the bank was starting to get even more aggressive, to the point where Andrei opened his eyes and he's thinking to himself, what is Yaroslav doing up there? Like, we're basically going in a circle at this point. We're spiraling midair. And so right as Andrei was about to get up and go see what the heck was going on, the plane began to shake really violently, and suddenly Andrei realized, oh my goodness, the plane could be stalling right now. There could be a real issue in the cockpit, and this is not some minor error. And so as passengers on the plane are starting to sense that something could be wrong here, I mean, the plane is like hard to the side and shaking, so people are starting to scream and cry, people are nervous. And so Andrei, he begins to stand up to go to the cockpit when suddenly the plane goes from just shaking and banking to basically rolling completely on its side. So all the windows are now on the ground and everybody's on their side. Andrei knew he could not go to the cockpit. There was no way to do that. And so all he could do was just hold on to his seat and pray they got out of this. And then just as quickly as all this started, it stopped. The plane kind of went back to level, it stopped shaking, and then Andrei heard the sound of the twin engines out on the wings roar as if the plane was kind of getting back up to speed, and for a second, it seemed like everything was okay. And so Andrei, sensing that this was his chance to get back to the cockpit and frankly just reassume command, because whatever was going on in there, it was not okay. And so Andrei, he got...
I don't like planes, y'all. I don't like planes, and I want to be a pilot. Explain how that works.
Got up and began running down the aisle to get to the cockpit. But right as he was about to grab the door, the plane suddenly tilted upward and they began rocketing up into the sky, so strong that Andrei was pinned to the carpet. And so for a couple of seconds, Andrei couldn't do anything, but then he began to hear the sound of the actual frame of the plane beginning to crack from all the pressure of accelerating so quickly up into the sky. And so with all of his strength, Andrei reached up, he's on his hands and knees, and he grabs the door handle to the cockpit and he opens it up, and the second he looks into the cockpit, he would have known exactly what was wrong. It would turn out Yaroslav's big surprise for his kids, that he promised Andrei and the first officer would demonstrate what an amazing father he was that he was going to let his kids fly the plane. Just for a second,
No.
but these...
No. What the? You have so much responsibility, dude. You have so much... Oh my. You are...
These are untrained children that have no idea how to fly a plane. And so when Andrei got up and went to go take a nap and Yaroslav took over, well, Yaroslav called up his kids who were in the main cabin, a teenage son and daughter, and they went into the cockpit and they sat down in the captain's chair and they began to fly the plane. And the daughter took the seat first in the captain's chair, and she was very careful not to touch any of the controls, even though Yaroslav was kind of encouraging her, to take the wheel and really see what it feels like. But she was nervous, and so she really didn't touch anything. But then Yaroslav's son, when he sat down in the captain's chair, he did grab the controls and he pulled on the wheel hard enough that he somehow disengaged the autopilot feature. And nobody noticed. And so as Yaroslav's son is yanking forward and backwards on the yoke, so the steering wheel of the plane began going in all these crazy directions because there was no autopilot to stop it. And by the time he had figured out what was wrong, it was too late because the plane had entered into an unrecoverable stall and it crashed into the foothills of Siberia.
So you got kids that don't even know how to do 2 + 2. But you expect them to fly a plane. Why are people so ridiculous? Like, you know how outrageous that is? You just took probably at least 10 people's lives because you wanted...
killing all 75 people on board.
75? People. You know, you got to have some sort of mind when you fly that thing. And you just don't got it. Why are you a pilot? Absolutely no sense to me. Why would you be a pilot? If you're gonna let your kids
Thank
fly?
you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. Back in 2018, I was very depressed. I had just left the military and I was really struggling to re-assimilate back into civilian society, and it was making me depressed. And even though I was encouraged from a young age to open up and talk about my feelings when I was feeling down, you know, as an adult, I just couldn't do it. I felt very insecure about it and was worried if I began talking about my problems that I would be viewed as kind of a weak person, or even worse, a complainer, something I was very worried about. But eventually I would go seek out a therapist because I became so miserable and it just had to happen. And I'm so glad I did, because as soon as I actually talked to a real therapist, I saw therapy is actually kind of great. As soon as you open up and kind of unburden yourself, a trained therapist can really help you work through your issues and come to terms with them, and over time, you'll get better. And so that's why today I want to talk to you about BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, which means you can get the help you need right from the comfort of your own home. And then after filling out a brief survey online, BetterHelp will usually be able to match you with one of their licensed therapists within 24 hours. And then it's up to you how you communicate with your therapist. You can chat with your therapist on your phone, your computer, phone call, video call, messaging. It's totally up to you. So if you're struggling right now and you think therapy...
I don't know who in the right mind would let a child drive a plane. Or just let your children in the cockpit. You know how crazy that is?
On the morning of September 19th, 2013, a man named Mark Casey sat with his girlfriend, Lynn Spalding, in the triage area of the emergency room at San Francisco General Hospital. A nurse took Lynn's temperature and her blood pressure, while Mark tried to explain what had been going on with Lynn over the past few weeks. Lynn, who was now 57, had been dealing with this really intense stomach pain. And so she had gone to the doctor, and she had been diagnosed with a urinary tract infection, and she was given antibiotics for it. But despite taking those antibiotics, it didn't get rid of the stomach pain. And in fact, her stomach pain was only getting worse. She was losing weight, and she just seemed really frail. But despite her condition obviously getting worse every single day, over the past few weeks, Lynn had basically refused to go back to the hospital, despite Mark saying, "We really gotta go, you're getting worse, we gotta have you looked at." But she just kept saying no. And then finally, when Mark noticed Lynn was now becoming somewhat despondent, like he would try to talk to her and her eyes would glaze over and she would look off into the distance like she didn't even hear him, Mark had just looked at Lynn and said, "You know what? I'm taking you to the hospital." And so he put her in the car, he brought her to the hospital, and now that he was here, he had to explain what was going on because Lynn was still despondent, just kind of staring off into space and very likely having no idea what was going on. And so after Mark gave all the information to the nurse said that, okay, Lynn needs to be admitted to the hospital. And so after a short wait, an orderly came over and pushed Lynn's wheelchair up to the 5th floor where she'd be staying, and Mark went with them. And then once in the room, Mark helped Lynn get settled in her bed. And again, Lynn is just kind of staring off into space, not really paying attention. And then a whole team of nurses and doctors came in and hooked Lynn up to IVs and different machines to make sure they could monitor her. And then at some point, one of the doctors pulled Mark aside and said, we think Lynn is dealing with some kind of infection, and so what we need to do is run some tests to figure out what this infection is, and then hopefully we can treat it. And so Mark said, okay, that sounds great. And then all day, Mark sat right next to Lynn and held her hand as the medical team came in and out of the room running all these tests. The following day, the medical team still didn't know what was wrong with Lynn. The tests they had run so far were inconclusive or were negative. Now, the biggest issue with Lynn was not trying to figure out what infection she had or how to cure her. Instead, it was, how do we keep Lynn in her hospital room? Because on this second day that Lynn was at the hospital, despite being very despondent still, any chance she got, she was getting out of her bed and trying to escape her room. And so the medical team, they kept having to go find her and bring her back to her room. And they tried to explain to her, like, Lynn, you're sick. That's why you're here. You need to stay in your room. But Lynn clearly was just not getting it. She was just not there. And she would just say to the team, I want to go home. I just want to go home. I want to go home. And they would say, well, Lynn, you got to get better first, and then you can go home. Now, Mark, like the medical staff, was also concerned about Lynn's behavior. It was not safe for her to get up and flee her hospital room. But Mark kind of
She doesn't even know why she's there. Like, you got people making it obvious that something's wrong, and they don't have any idea. Well, she doesn't have any idea on why she's there, or the fact that she is there, and that she wants to go home. So every time the doctors leave, she tries to leave with them.
Secretly thought, maybe this is a good sign, because the day before, Lynn couldn't even walk on her own, and now today, she's walking around on her own trying to escape the hospital, which is bad. But, she's ambulatory. That's going to be a good sign. And also, Mark was thinking that because Lynn was fleeing her room over and over again, she's going to get even better medical care because the staff has to be super focused on her. And so Mark was feeling kind of optimistic that Lynn was on the road to recovery. The next morning, so now Lynn has been at the hospital for 2 days at this point, a nurse went into Lynn's room to check on her at about 10:15 a.m., and she walked up to Lynn, who was in her bed, and Lynn immediately told the nurse that she wanted to go home, and the nurse said, sorry, Lynn, we still don't know what's wrong with you. You got to stay here for now. But again, it was pretty clear Lynn did not understand what the nurse was saying. And so Lynn was not agitated. She was laying in bed and did not appear to, want to flee the room anytime soon. And so the nurse took Lynn's vitals. They were all basically normal. And then the nurse wrote down on Lynn's chart that her condition as of this moment was fair. And then the nurse left the room. And once this nurse was gone, Lynn laid in bed for a second. And then when nobody else came in the room, she sat up, she hopped off the bed, and she took off her hospital gown. She pulled out all the cords and wires that were on her. Then she put on her jeans, her boots, her jacket. She grabbed her purse off the table, and she walked out the door. And the second she walked out the door, she would have been in this long hallway, except her room was at the end of the hallway. So when she stepped out into that hallway, if she turned right, she would have seen a long, long stretch of hallway with other hospital rooms and lots of staff and doctors and nurses kind of walking around. But to her left, it would have been a dead end with a single blue door with a green exit sign over the top of it. And so Lynn, she steps into the hallway, she looks down the long side to the right, then she looks to the left, she sees the blue door, and she goes to the blue door, she opens it up, and she disappears inside.
Hold up. So you got a situation where you sit here
Room and saw she wasn't there.
Hold up. You got a situation where you sit there and you got a patient escaping the room. And you know that she has previously tried to escape beforehand, so what sense does it make it to not take the precautions that she might try to escape again?
She reported Lynn missing. Now, remember, the hospital was well aware. Door, she opens it up, and she disappears inside. When the nurse came back to Lynn's room and saw she wasn't there, she reported Lynn missing. Now, remember, the hospital was well aware of the fact that Lynn had been trying to escape for the past 48 hours, and so nobody was really shocked by this. In fact, the hospital, their first move was to contact Mark, who had actually gone home the night before to get some real sleep and to take a shower, and so they contacted Mark, and they said, "Hey, Lynn's not here. Is she with you?" And Mark was like, "No, I'm home. She's not here. I have not seen her. I haven't talked to her. I have no idea where she is." And so the hospital at this point began this huge search in their building, just checking the entire property for Lynn, but there was no trace of her. And so the police were contacted and they launched a search both of the hospital grounds and also of the surrounding areas, and they too could not find a trace of Lynn. It was like Lynn just vanished into thin air. That is, until October 8th, 2013, so 17 days after Lynn had strolled through that blue exit door. On that day, October 8th, a hospital maintenance worker was walking down the long hallway in the hospital, not on the 5th floor where Lynn was staying, but one floor below, so on the 4th floor. And he's walking down this long hallway in the direction of the dead end side, so the same side that Lynn was on where her room was, but again, one floor above. And the maintenance worker, he walks all the way to the end of this hallway on the 4th floor, and he arrives in front of the blue door with the green exit sign above it. Again, this is below where Lynn was, but it looks the same. And the maintenance worker, he opened up the door, and when he looked out of the 4th floor door, he just froze, because what he was looking at just seemed impossible. And then he had this urge to scream, but he knew there were all these patients and kids and doctors and stuff in the hallway behind him, and he didn't want to scare anyone. And so very quietly, he reached down and grabbed his radio, and he called for help. In order to explain what happened next, you need to look at this picture. So in this picture, on the right-hand side, you see there are two outdoor landings with people on them. The one on top is the 5th floor landing, and the one below it, with a single person on it, is the 4th floor landing. And to get onto these outdoor landings, you have to walk through those blue exit doors at the end of those hallways. These blue doors are emergency exits. And so when you go out these blue doors, once they shut, they lock automatically. But now you're out on this outdoor landing, and immediately to your right, although you can't see it in this picture, there is actually another door that leads to this enclosed stairwell that will bring you all the way to the ground floor, where there's another door that's unlocked that will bring you out to safety. And so again, you walk out one of those blue doors, you're on this landing, you can turn, open up another door, you're in the stairwell, and you can evacuate. So, in theory, if you were a person that really wanted to escape this hospital, like Lynn did, going out one of these blue door emergency exits was a great idea. It would bring you to the ground. This is a way to escape the hospital. But remember, Lynn was totally confused. Mentally, she was just not there because of whatever illness was affecting her. And so when she walked out that door, she arrived on the 5th floor landing, and the door shut behind her and it locked. And the theory is, as soon as Lynn got out there, maybe she had some second thoughts and wanted to go back into the hospital. And so she turned and she grabbed that door and tried to open it back up again, but because it locks automatically, it wouldn't open. And so Lynn did have the wherewithal to turn and see this other door that led to this enclosed stairwell, the emergency stairwell that did go to the ground floor. She could absolutely go all the way down and escape. She could do that. She went into the stairwell and she went down one floor to the 4th floor landing. And when she got there, she left the stairwell and she went to that door that would lead back into the hospital on the 4th floor. And she tried it, but of course it was locked. And then again, instead of her just going back into the stairwell and going down and escaping to safety, she, for some reason, just stayed on the 4th floor landing. Again, you got to remember that she's not all there mentally, and so she was confused.
That poor lady, man. You got emergency landings. Imagine, like, whatever was affecting her to the point where she couldn't think to keep going down or to just try to find another escape. Like, that sounds like Alzheimer's to me, but that poor lady, man.
And she just stayed there on the landing, basically waiting to be rescued. But despite these huge searches of the hospital property by hospital staff and by the police, for some reason, this area, this landing on the 4th floor, was never checked. And so nobody found her. That is until October 4th. So at this point, Lynn has been outside for 13 days on this landing, and a researcher from the hospital, for whatever reason, exited out one of these emergency doors, and they began making their way downstairs. And when they passed by the 4th floor landing, they spotted Lynn on the ground on the 4th floor landing. But instead of going over to her and seeing if she was okay, this researcher just called security and said, hey, there's a patient outside on the 4th floor landing, like, come check it out. And then instead of waiting for security, the researcher just left, leaving Lynn alone. And
come on, y'all. You don't sit here and be like, yeah, I need security. You don't even stay to make sure security arrives, and you know you have a missing patient. 13 days later, almost 2 freaking weeks. 2 freaking weeks, and you have no clue. Why are people like this? Ooh, it pisses me off. Ooh.
security at the hospital who said they were going to go check, they didn't. And so 4 more days would go by with still nobody officially finding Lynn. And then finally on October 8th, the hospital mate with still nobody officially finding Lynn, leaving Lynn alone. And security at the hospital who said they were going to go check, they didn't. And so 4 more days would go by with still nobody officially finding Lynn. And then finally on October 8th, the hospital maintenance worker opened up the blue door on the 4th floor, and he saw the 4th floor landing, that exterior landing, and he saw Lynn, and he knew she was dead. Officials were never able to determine when Lynn died, so it's not clear how long she was alive out on that landing. But it is possible she could have been alive when that researcher found her, but obviously help didn't come in time. Ultimately, Lynn's family...
That is ridiculous. And she could have still been alive too. That's even the worst part. Like, I don't understand why... people are not in the right mind.
Family would sue the city and the hospital, and they would be awarded $3 million.
This is why I stopped shopping on Amazon, and you should too. Don't spend another dime on Amazon until you watch this first.
Watch this.
I don't care.
On May 28th, 1986, a Florida real estate agent named Marguerite Welty walked up to the front door of this little white stucco home sitting right on the edge of Lake Placid in Florida. Marguerite pulled out a key from her pocket, she unlocked the door, opened it up, and then she turned around, and standing right in front of her were her clients, this young couple named Lois and Richard Goodman, who were thinking about buying a vacation home. And so this was one of the homes they were checking out. And so Marguerite smiled at her clients and gestured for them to come inside. The house sat at the end of a quiet, shady street lined with huge trees and other small vacation homes, and a lot of these vacation homes were perfectly manicured and beautiful, but the house they were touring today was not. It was unmaintained and overgrown, the paint was chipped and fading. It just looked bad, because the owner of this property at one time had used this house as their vacation home, but lately they had just kind of stopped coming out here, and so they really never came out to check on the property, and so it definitely had the look of an abandoned property. And now the owner didn't even know if they could fix it anymore, and so they decided they would just sell it and let somebody else deal with it. And so Marguerite led Richard and Lois into the house, and she brought them right into the carpeted living room, and the house was very musky and dark. All the windows were shut and all the blinds were drawn, and so Marguerite kind of instinctively walked over to the windows and began opening up the curtains and opening up the blinds, letting sunlight into the house. And so as this room is suddenly being lit up by the sunlight, behind her, Marguerite hears Lois and Richard start to laugh at something. And so Marguerite turned around to see what was so funny, and when she saw what Lois and Richard were laughing at, Marguerite did not think it was very funny. In fact, she thought the fact that they were laughing right now was kind of rude, especially when you considered what this couple had asked of Marguerite. They had come to Marguerite and said, hey, we want to buy a vacation home. It needs to be perfect. It needs to be on the water. It needs to have this and this and this. But we have a tiny budget. Go find us homes. And so Marguerite had really struggled to find vacation homes that were in their budget, but then she had found this diamond in the rough, this house on the coast of Lake Placid. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, it had a garage, direct access to the water, it even had a boat dock. I mean, this house was perfect. Now, of course, this house had obvious downsides, like the fact that it was clearly a fixer-upper. I mean, anybody who bought this home would have to put a lot of work into just making it livable again. And then also, there was a distinct weird vibe about the property itself. Because the owner was never there, they had covered all the furniture inside of this home with white sheets, which kind of gave it a sort of haunted house vibe. And then also, there was virtually nothing of value inside of this home, because again, the owner was like never here. But for some reason, there was this super intense security system on the house. I mean, there was cameras everywhere, and the windows had metal bars over them. And so the aesthetic inside and outside this house was not a good one. But again, you know, Marguerite felt like if they could just look past the negative stuff, this was really the perfect place for them. But now, here Marguerite's clients were, laughing away at the kind of goofy interior of this home. It's like they were being totally disrespectful both to Marguerite and frankly to the owner of this property. I mean, this is a good opportunity. What are you doing? But ultimately, Marguerite couldn't force her clients to be appreciative of this. And so she just kind of laughed along with them, but then very quickly changed the subject and told them, you know, hey, let's go walk around the rest of the house. Make sure you see the whole place before you pass judgment. But Marguerite only had to lead Richard and Lois around the house for a couple more minutes to figure out they definitely were not in the market for this house. They could not look past the bizarre kind of spooky almost atmosphere inside the house and how run down it was. You know, so they were just not going to put an offer on this house, and Marguerite knew it. And so even though Marguerite was definitely frustrated, she told her clients, you know, don't worry about it. I'll go back to the drawing board. I'll find more properties, and we'll check those out. And so Marguerite led Richard and Lois out of the property. She shut and locked the door behind her, and then she and her clients left. 2 days later, on May 30th, 1986, the owner of this rundown old vacation home came by to check on the property. Basically, because they were trying to sell it, they just wanted to go up and make sure there were no obviously bad things about the property. They knew it was in rough shape, but, you know, they're just doing a sanity check. And so they get to this property, they open up the door, and they step inside, and right away, the owner is hit with this horrible smell. Now, the owner knew it normally did not smell great inside this home, but this smell he was smelling now was just so bad. It was so pungent, he knew it was not normal. And so the owner began walking around the house trying to figure out where the smell was coming from, and at some point he found himself in the living room, and his eyes happened to land on the thing that Richard and Lois Goodman had been laughing at 2 days earlier. Except when the owner saw this thing, he didn't think it was funny at all. In fact, what he did is he instantly turned around, ran out of the house, grabbed a phone, and called 911. 4 days earlier, on May 26th, a 28-year-old man named Thomas Lopez Ruiz, who was living in this makeshift campsite down by the water near Lake Placid, he decided to leave his campsite and go into town to try to earn some money. Thomas did not have a steady job. Instead, he did odd jobs in town whenever he could to earn a few bucks. But on this day, when Thomas went into town, there was no work. So Thomas decided he would go rob one of the many vacation homes along the coastline of Lake Placid. And the home that he picked is the same vacation home that Marguerite would take the Goodmans to 2 days later. And so Thomas arrives in front of this overgrown property, and he tries the doors, and they're all locked. However, Thomas had a plan. Thomas was a pretty small guy. He was about 5 foot 2 inches tall, only weighed about 140 pounds, and so he figured he could just slip through the chimney. That's how he could break into the house. And at first, it went great. You know, he slipped in no problem, and before long, he was making his way down towards the inside of the house. But what Thomas realized as he went down the chimney is the chimney was not perfectly straight up and down. Instead, it was sort of tapered, where at the top it was wide, but the deeper you got, so the farther down you went in the chimney, the narrower the inside of the chimney got. And so when Thomas was almost all the way down the chimney, he got stuck. He could not get the rest of the way down. But where he got stuck, he couldn't grab the top of the chimney. He couldn't pull himself out. And so he is absolutely wedged, can't go down, can't go up. And making matters even worse was every time he exhaled, his chest would shrink a little bit, and that would cause him to slip a little bit farther, a little bit deeper into the chimney. And then when he would try to breathe in again, his chest would not be able to fully expand again. And so basically, every second that went by, Thomas was sinking lower and lower and lower by little bits, making it...
I cannot imagine, y'all. I cannot imagine being squoze to death and being not able to, not like completely not able to breathe, but like it feels like your rib cage is just gonna bust on your lungs. Like, imagine how bad that would feel.
Harder and harder and harder to breathe, and you got to figure that he was screaming for help, which again was causing him to breathe a bunch, causing him to sink even farther, and so it would have made breathing extremely difficult. And so Thomas is like in this absolute claustrophobic nightmare, and without outside help, he had no chance of survival. 2 days later, Marguerite Welty brought the Goodmans into that property, and she would open up the blinds, and sunlight would come into the living room, and Marguerite would hear Lois and Richard laughing at something, and she would turn around, and she would see they were pointing at the fireplace, and visible in this fireplace were two legs dangling down inside the chimney. They were not so far down that they were touching the ground.
Y'all gotta be tripping. You gotta be out of your mind to not realize the fact that there's... How could that...
Ground, they were just kind of suspended in the air. And Lois and Richard, based on the way the house looked already, you know, the kind of spooky vibe, you know, there's white sheets over all the furniture, there are these bars on all the windows, everything is dark and dirty and kind of gross. Like, there's this haunted house vibe to this place, and they're thinking, this must be a Halloween decoration or some sort of prank, you know, a mannequin kind of jammed up into the chimney, maybe to look like a robber breaking into your house or something, that the owner never took down, because clearly the owner stopped taking care of this property, and so it kind of makes sense that these decorations would be left out. And so Lois and Richard are laughing at this Halloween decoration, and Marguerite, she looks at the legs too, and also thinks they're just some Halloween decoration, doesn't think anything of it. And so finally they end up leaving, and that was it. But as I'm sure you all have guessed, of course those legs were not mannequin legs, those were Thomas's legs. And in fact, the creepiest part about this is Thomas may have been alive during the house tour. The autopsy showed he actually did not die of asphyxiation, so he didn't suffocate. He died from dehydration, which takes about 2 days, and this house tour was about 2 days in. And the day prior to the house tour, a neighbor had been outside and they thought they heard someone yelling inside of the property, but for some reason, you know, the neighbor just didn't do anything about it. And so there's a pretty good chance Thomas was barely alive as they were touring the house. But, you know, by the time the owner came back 2 days later and smelled that horrible smell, Thomas had passed away, and that smell was the smell of his body decomposing. Also, just to close the loop on this, it's not clear why the homeowner had that really aggressive security system with the bars on the windows. He just did.
But yeah, someone sneaking in through the chimney thinking they're Santa Claus.
On the morning of May 26, 1990, Marlene Warren was at home inside of her beautiful mansion in Florida when she heard a knock on the front door. Marlene was busy and was hoping that her adult son might go answer the door, but when she looked over to the living room where her son was, she saw he was laying down watching TV and didn't even seem to have heard the knock on the door. So Marlene sighed and just walked over to the front door herself and opened it up. And to her surprise, standing on the other side of the door was a person dressed up in a clown costume, holding flowers and balloons. Now, Marlene loved clowns, and she had recently celebrated her 40th birthday, so she figured this must be someone's birthday gift to her, and she was thrilled.
But after the clown handed Marlene the flowers and balloons, there was this loud popping sound inside of Marlene's house, and then
his podcast that he has going. That's what that is. Camera is like trying to focus on whatever is going on right now. There we go. Oh, yep. Nope, that's not gonna work. Come on, bud. Hey, do I need to turn this up? Is that why? I do. That is most definitely why. Then to not have it super blue. It's also just because this is a low light circumstance, which makes sense. But well, I hope you guys enjoyed this. And you know, it's definitely been a blast. It's definitely been one fun live stream. But I got some things to do with my folks. And I got a couple other videos to upload. So thank y'all for taking your time. Thank you for spending your time with me. And I hope y'all have a nice one. You know I'm gone.
I gotta keep it playing. Mama told me gotta watch my behavior. Living my life, but it's just to be major. I gotta pick who I want with these flavors. Super geeking, thought a vape was a laser. Super swimming in the I'm a slayer. Always cooking, it don't feel like a labor. And niggas plotting, so we gotta erase. I gotta keep it playing. Mama told me gotta watch my behavior. Living my life, but it's just to be major. I gotta pick who I want with these flavors. Super geeking, thought a vape was a laser. Super swimming in the I'm a slayer. Niggas plotting, so we gotta. Stay in the stool cause I know it's my year. Sipping on lean, I don't wanna sip beer. Got a baddie and she say I'm top tier. I told the jeweler put rocks in my ear. Snakes in their eyes, I be smelling their fear. I be one with this key so we always aware. I put Montclair on top of my scars. They said they want pride, don't know where to stop. She don't wanna love it.